here?
I believe she's
I'm here, Kevin.
Oh, excellent. Welcome, Councillor Green. And,
I'm sorry for all the technical issues.
No problem. They happen. And I'm just going to, so if we're all here, then I'm going to call this meeting to order. And so I'm going to be looking, I've got multiple screens going here, so I'm going to be looking at towards this way and towards this way. So if I'm not looking at the camera at any given moment, I am still very present here. Thank you, everyone. At 6:06, I'll call the meeting to order. Before we start, we'd just like to acknowledge that we're gathered, in this case virtually, on the lands that are the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish people, specifically the Lekwungen-speaking people known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, and recognize that their connections to these lands continues to this day. Up first on the agenda of the Special Committee of the Whole is the approval of the agenda. Can I have someone to move the agenda? Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? Councillor Green, I'm just going to expect you to speak up if you're in opposition to any of the motions. Is that acceptable?
That's great, thank you. And yes, I'm not opposed.
Thank you. And item 3.1 of the agenda, the draft financial plan, version 2. I believe we have again Mr. Payne here to present the updates to this financial plan. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. As I did at the last meeting, I'm going to begin the meeting with the overview presentation. Not a lot of new content in that presentation, but worthwhile just to remind council and the public the context in which decisions are being made, and for those that are watching for the first time, for their benefit as well. So I'm going to start that presentation. Just if I could share my screen here. There. Okay, and can everyone see my screen?
We can. Thank you, Mr. Payne.
Great. Okay, so the agenda for today's meeting is we'll begin again with budget principles. We'll talk about the budget process and timeline. We'll look at the financial plan in its entirety. We'll talk a little bit about asset management and reserves, as we do every financial plan meeting. We're going to have a brief look at the revenue this evening, and then we'll jump into some operating budgets, including planning, engineering, public works, and parks, rec, and culture. And we're also, time permitting, going to jump into capital tonight, which would be corporate admin, finance, and fire as well. So since the last meeting, staff did receive some feedback from council in terms of integration into the financial plan. We've also integrated preliminary financial results, which have been provided in Appendix A. We don't really discuss those results in exhaustive detail during the financial planning process. Preliminary results are integrated into the operating budgets as we go through each operating budget, so you can have a sense of how last year's performance was. But the consolidated picture of those results are now in Appendix A of version 2. There was one capital project carryover missed. That was my bad. So there was a Oak Bay Rec Center transformer replacement, which was underway at the end of last year, and it's not complete. So the funds for that have been carried over, and it's added to the schedule now in version 2 of the financial plan. And staff also received a resolution from council at the most recent council meeting regarding the Chamber of Commerce. So that motion read that membership in the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce be included in the 21 provisional budget for council's consideration. Here's the tax impact of that. It's very modest on the size of the entire budget. So 0.0125% tax increase, 37 cents per median residential. And what is required, however, even if the funding for it has been integrated into the financial plan, is direction from council as to whether or not we are to actually register the district as a member of the chamber. So it's one thing to put funding into the financial plan. It's another thing for council to direct staff to actually become a member. So we are still awaiting that direction if that's for council to consider. I haven't set aside a specific place in the financial plan deliberation today to discuss that. So I'll really leave it to council to decide what an appropriate time to either make that motion or have further discussion on that would be.
Mr. Payne, can I just ask that you just flag that for us so that before the end of this process, obviously that motion without budget means nothing, and a budget without that motion means nothing.
Right.
But I think that's going to be part of the final pieces that we consider as we look at the overall impacts. So I just don't want that to be dropped. If that stays on the budget, then we should have that motion, and if we choose to remove it, we should do that. But can I just leave it to you and before the end of this process to just make sure it doesn't get left behind?
Yeah, yes, you bet, your worship. And I think a good place for it would actually be at the top of the operating budget. So I'll bring it back for council consideration before the finance and IT operating budget presentation, which will be shortly after the revenue discussion. Okay, so some of the principles used to develop this budget, we developed it from a service level approach. So staff are assuming that council wants to continue with existing service levels, and we've integrated what the financial cost of that are. We've adjusted budgets year after year to ensure those service levels continue. We've aligned funding sources for projects that are significant in price tag and infrequent. We've used our accumulated surplus reserve to fund this as opposed to ongoing tax funding. And we've carried over projects from the previous year that were approved. So work on those projects continue while we deliberate the financial plan for 2021. The 5-year financial plan is an authority to spend in each of the 5 years that are presented in the 5-year financial plan. So that's 2021 through 2025. Every year, however, council meets to amend that direction and refine that financial plan. But you do provide authorization for each of those years when you meet every year. So I remind council that when deliberating this year, the years 2021 and 2022 are very important. Should council approve a number of projects that appear in the 2022 column of the 2021 through 2025 financial plan, staff are authorized to spend on that project beginning January 1, 2022. And this principle is underway right now. There's a number of capital projects that council approved beginning 2021 in last year's financial plan that staff have begun. And that just ensures that we can really continue operations and continue working towards achieving the strategic priorities set out by council. Life cycle costing consideration has been integrated into the capital project. So if council is presented with a new capital project, a new piece of capital that provides new service or an enhanced service level to the community, we present the full life cycle cost of that capital asset. One example from tonight's presentation will be the electronic records management document system. So that's a new piece of software, not a current standard that we execute. And so the life cycle, the full life cycle of that capital project are presented in one of the schedules in the financial plan. So council can have an idea of the full cost that they're committing the district to by approving the expenditure. I like to remind the public that the financial plan document that's posted on our website and attached to the agenda is it's not a statutory document. It's a document to provide more transparency and assist in decision making. The statutory document that results is the financial plan bylaw, but summarized on a very high level and provides expenditure authority. It doesn't really provide a lot of insight into what those operations and the service levels are expected from those funds. So the district supplements that with the financial plan document as most municipalities do. And that's what we're aiming for here. The financial plan is prepared with a long-term vision, and we're not just considering the 2021 financial year. So often the public would like to know, how do things appear in the financial plan? And there's a couple of main ways. First of all, they appear there from council approved service levels, whether explicit or implicit. And the implicit service levels are basically the service levels that we are carrying out right now, and staff are continuing those services. And then there's also service levels that are explicitly directed by council. For instance, in 2021, council directed staff to increase the service level for curbside organic pickup. So that service level had been integrated into the solid waste budget that you'll see today. We also integrate council directed initiatives, and often these come out of the strategic planning sessions, and they're also initiatives recommended by staff to support the strategic goals, the overarching strategic goals. And lastly, staff interpretation of action needed to implement council endorsed plans show up in here. So for instance, if council is presented with a master plan, and that master plan has a number of outcomes and intentions in it, and council endorses that plan, staff will then implement and integrate the cost of the implementation of that plan into the financial plan. A good example of this is the urban forest plan presented to council over the last number of years, and you see evidence of staff integrating that plan into this financial plan, both into the ongoing operating budget and into the special initiatives budget. So staff are careful not to increase service levels or decrease service levels. We believe that's really in council's wheelhouse. They're stewards of the community, and they council listens to their constituents and directs staff to implement service levels, and also must consider resource constraints on that. So those are political decisions in council's wheelhouse, and so we don't take it upon ourselves to increase or decrease service levels without checking with council. Public input is welcome at every stage, as was during the February 4th meeting. I'm assuming that the chair will stop after presentations and ask for public input, and that can continue through the budget process. February 18th is our next budget meeting, and the budget wrap up is a council meeting on March 8th. Staff prepare the financial plan in its entirety. It's in a condition that could be approved by council from the beginning. However, council at any point can refine that financial plan and make changes, and staff will reflect their direction as we go along. Staff are really looking for council direction. Obviously, we listen carefully to what councillor and councillors have to say as we go through. However, if there is substantive changes needed in the financial plan, we're looking for that council motion to ensure we can, that is the will of all of council. As we move through this, we'll have different versions. We're on version 2 right now. We'll probably still be on version 2 by the February 18th meeting, only because the agenda deadline is tomorrow. So if there's changes needed today, it's not likely to get it posted by tomorrow. But keep an eye on that version at the bottom of the financial plan. So our timeline today, we talked about a lot of the operating budget last meeting, and we're going to continue with operating budget today. And then we're hoping to begin some of the capital budgets. The capital budgets today include finance, IT, corporate administration, and the fire department. In the grand scheme of the financial plan, those are the simpler capital budgets. We've reserved February 18th for capital for engineering and public works, as well as Parks, Rec, and Culture. We anticipate that there's greater community desire to provide input during that meeting. And so we wanted to reserve a spot for that so that folks know when to show up when they want to speak to that budget. And then if all goes well, and unlike last year when there was a pandemic that occurred shortly after our financial plan meetings, hopefully we can wrap up with the financial plan on March 8th and proceed with a financial plan bylaw preparation after that. As mentioned, council is free to make decisions in regards to the budget at every stage. And if we receive direction at this committee, we will integrate it to the next plan of the financial, next version of the financial plan, and it will be supported in the financial plan bylaw. So any motions along the way. We're keeping track and we're integrating into the financial plan. So we're just going to go into the financial plan overview now. We've got 5-year operating expenditures exceeding $220 million. So it's a significant expenditure. And we're estimating $84 million in capital expenditures, or that's the limit that is being imposed in the financial plan bylaw. $16.8 million of this capital expenditures would come from grants. So the main culprit there would be the Upland Sewer Separation Project. There's also a number of other projects that are grant contingent, such as phase 2 of the Todd House refurbishment and a few other capital projects. $5 million of that $84 million would be borrowing. That would be for the Carnarvon Park building. And the remainder would come from reserves. So that's a significant draw on our reserves. Currently, we're around about $50 million in our reserves right now. So if we were planning on drawing $61.5 million from the reserves, we'll have to be replenishing that. And council certainly has increased the reserve transfers over the years. So there is, over $8 million going into our reserves annually. So we wouldn't be able to spend this capital expenditure were it not for council support of increasing the transfers to reserve budgets. And there's a small portion of this capital budget that would be funded by fees and charges and developer contributions. So to talk about the risk to the financial plan, the first and foremost, of course, is COVID-19. In 2020, this impacted the Parks, Rec, and Culture financial situation by a net amount of $1.1 million. So that's reduced revenues, less reduced expenditures of $1.1 million. And we had forecasted approximately $1.5 million. So it's a little bit better of a financial picture than we had forecasted in Q3. In 2020, however, we expect the impacts of COVID to last the entire year. So that's longer duration than it was last year. So there's a $2.5 million net revenue decrease budgeted for 2021 when compared to the original budget in 2020. And how we made up for that, council resolved to use the COVID-19 Restart Grant to maintain existing services and make up for that revenue shortfall. Last year, there was $450,000 in incremental COVID-19 expenses. And our investment revenues over the projected investment revenues over the 5 years have dropped by $2.5 million. And that revenue was primarily slated to contribute additional funds to our reserve. So it's really, if we want to make up for that drop, it would have to be in tax revenue or borrowing. So in terms of our reserves, there's a number of risks to our reserves. There's some capital grants that we're depending on to move forward with some capital projects. So that's over $8 million in grant applications that are pending. If those grant applications aren't successful, then we'll have to find another source of funding for those, and that would either be in borrowing or in reserves. And then we have another number of asset management plans underway. The big one being the facilities management plan. That's one of the asset classes I would say that we have not a terrible amount of clarity around what the short-term financial impact of what our facilities capital plan should be. And so we expect that the facilities master plan may identify more deferred maintenance that needs to be taken care of in the short term, and it would populate our capital plan as a result. And lastly, we've got collective bargaining underway for fire and police. We have integrated an expected increase for both of those, but we don't know where those will land. So the 5-year financial plan proposes the following tax increases. There is some flexibility in terms of council direction there. Staff have increased the transfers to reserve in years 2023 through 2025 compared to the previous financial plan in 2020. That's primarily to make up for the lost investment revenue, which we expected to push us close to sustainable annual funding for our capital. So if we wanted to make that, then there's an increased tax impact for that as well. But council can engage in different strategies for that. We talked last week about potential for borrowing, certainly an opportunity for that. But we'll talk more about those asset management strategies coming up in the following slides. So this is how the 5-year tax increase breaks down. You see the majority of most of the tax increases are due to forced growth. In 2021, our forced growth is kind of funny because our actual materials and supplies and conferences and dues and all those inflationary impacted forced growth factors were actually quite low. Many of the budgets actually didn't increase their office supplies. They're certainly not their conferences or the training, the professional development, the materials and supplies. They didn't increase those budget much. But in 2021, there was a lot of revenue, natural revenue that was lost or reduced in the financial plan, the building and planning department, even in the facilities leases department, which pushed up that forced growth. I was sort of optimistic that our forced growth was going to be below 2% because we're in a low inflationary environment, but that's not what panned out. Thereafter, we're expecting forced growth to be around mostly less than 2%, except for in 2025. The next component is infrastructure. So you see there's healthy additions to our transfer to reserve budgets in those years. This year's 1.88%. There's a large increase slated that has always been slated for 2022 to the tune of $800,000. And there's varying degrees, of infrastructure increases thereafter. There's some new staffing costs. In this year, there is some envelope funding approved for staffing to support sustainable service delivery, which has been prioritized. And then we've got the new debt costs in 2025 and a couple other small items in 2021 and 2023. So in terms of how this breaks down for the residential median here, I've put a slide here so everyone can understand how it breaks down a little bit. The average increase for the median residential property in 2021 would be $208. The median property in Oak Bay is $1.2 million. So it gives you an idea of what type of property we're talking about and how much the increase would be. And we've broken it down by the different factors. So for instance, in 2021, the median residential property would pay an extra $60 up in the year for infrastructure. And in 2022, they would pay an additional $100 in infrastructure and so on and so forth. So another way of looking at it, thank you to Councillor Green, who actually prompted me to put it in terms of dollars and cents as well as percentages. So that's available for public consumption there. So our asset management at a glance, there are a number of things underway. For every single asset class, we have some sort of plan. They're in various degrees of maturity is what I would say. For instance, our buildings and facilities is on the lower end of maturity, which is why a facilities master plan is planned. Our sanitary sewer master plan is currently underway. And it will be completed in 2021. And then a storm sewer master plan will be completed in 2023. So we'll begin in 2022. So once those master plans are completed, they're going to be quite a significant portion of our entire asset base will have a master plan for it, which provides significant insight to the community for what's required to maintain existing service levels. Other master plans, the water master plan light was completed in 2019 through 2020. We've got a good and robust vehicles and equipment replacement plan. And then, at some point we want to start talking about our natural assets as well. We have an urban forest management plan, but we could talk about other natural assets as well in that plan. So our asset management funding has grown significantly over the years, and especially during this council's mandate. In 2018, we estimated that annual funding for capital was about 59% of what we thought the sustainable level would be. In 2020, we got up to 82%. In 2021, we jumped into 85%. And in 2022, we'd see that's the largest jump with that $800,000 increase slated. So that's where that's the trend line so far. We've chosen $10 million as the annual amount. We've looked at our asset classes and on a very high level estimated what we think the useful life of those asset classes are, and therefore how much we should be setting aside annually. But replacement costs vary significantly. And absent of information, that's the best we could do. So that sustainability level might change at some point, but we have it pegged for about $10 million based on the information we have right now. So this graph here just shows the progress we've made in individual asset classes. You'll notice some of the easier asset classes to fund we solved pretty quickly in 2020. The vehicles and fire, for instance, I just provided some increases to the dedicated funding there. And for the asset classes that don't have dedicated funding, like buildings and facilities, they're just going up as general funding goes up as well. So overall, we've graded our asset replacement funding at about 85%, which is an okay rating if you go by this color-coded rating system. So I'll just introduce the reserves that we have on hand. And when I use the term reserves, it's a broad term to use because reserves can be established by bylaw. That's the most common way. We have a reserve bylaw. But reserves can also be established by resolution or financial plan. One of our most significant reserves is our infrastructure replacement reserve. That one is not established by bylaw. In fact, it's established by council resolution and it's established by the financial plan. You can have reserves established by administrative judgment. So the CFO says, well, I think we need to set aside $300,000 for legal liability and this or whatever. However, they have no legal basis. Council can use those funds for what they feel is best. We have accumulated surplus reserve. This is just the reserve that results from any budget surpluses we have over the year. So if we underspend overall in our financial plan, whatever we will underspend will go into the accumulated surplus reserve. If we overspend, which we shouldn't because we're not legally allowed to do that, it would come out of the accumulated surplus reserve. We use this fund to fund operating projects since they're usually a result of operating surpluses. So there's a good funding alignment there. There's some reserves that are required by legislation. So for instance, you might have a DCC reserve, which is established by legislation. And then there's some reserves with external limitations. So our gas tax reserve, COVID-19 has an external limitation. For instance, the province said you can use it, but you're going to have to report on what you're using it for. So it's limited that way. So here's a brief look at what our reserves look like right now, about $56.7 million. The most significant reserve there is our capital works reserve. The majority of our capital works reserve is really set aside for replacement of existing capital, but it can be used for brand new capital that is not replacement of existing capital. We have been building up our infrastructure, our renewal reserve, currently at $5.6 million. You'll see in the preceding slide that reserve really continues to grow because that's where most of our annual contributions go as we increase them. We've got an upland sewer separation gas tax reserve at $6.2 million. That only really accumulates by the interest that's earned on that reserve annually. We've stopped contributing to that, but that's our main funding source for the upland sewer separation, complemented with hopefully a grant contribution. So what will this financial plan do to our reserves? And keep in mind, this is what happens to our reserves if we spend every single dollar in our financial plan. And in reality, although the district does not deliberately return surpluses happen. There's vacancies in positions, or there's reasons why a department underspends. If that happens, it accumulates in our reserve. So if we spend exactly what our operating budgets say, and all of the capital, the $84 million presented, then our reserves will fall from $56.7 million to $44.2 million. So that's a net decrease of $12.5 million in 5 years. And that accomplishes $84 million in capital. But I wanted to take a closer look at what reserves are doing what in that time, because that might be appropriate or it might be a cause for concern. So I look at the most prominent classes of reserves here. The top one being our capital replacement reserve. You see there is a decline in that reserve from $30 million to 25, but it goes significantly down. It goes down below $20 million and back up to 25. There's all sorts of reasons for that. A couple being we're at a point where we are refurnishing much of our fleet. So we've got over $3 million in our fleet for fleet replacement for our fire trucks. And then Public Works, over the last 2 years, will have spent $2 million on their fleet refresh. So I mean, that is the point of replacement reserves. They're supposed to build up until it's time to use them. And when it's time to use them, they're supposed to go down. And that way the volatility in the reserve, there's volatility in reserve, but there isn't volatility in the tax rates, right? It's something you're supposed to contribute to slowly over a number of years. The next class there is just our general surplus and reserves. We're not forecasting any surpluses. We're not supposed to budget for that. So it's relatively flat. There is some contributions for things like our major crimes reserve with the police department, which hopefully we don't have to use, but it's there if we have to use it. And then we've got a new capital reserve amounts that go from $7.7 million down to nothing. And this is really mostly your uplands sewer separation reserve. So that reserve, it's supposed to go to zero. We're supposed to spend that money if in fact it's council's desire to separate the uplands sewer separation, and so far you've indicated it is. So much of the reserve drop, over $7 million of the reserve drop forecasted in the previous slide, was supposed to happen at some point, which belays a little bit of the concern that I would otherwise have in the trajectory of our reserves. So we talked last week a little bit about debt. We're projected to pay off our debt by 2024. And even before that, we were sitting at a very low debt level relative to our legal liability. So we were at about 2.2% of our debt servicing limit in 2023. That's the forecast, which basically means we could borrow up to 50 times as much if we wanted to. Of course, that's not the recommendation you're getting from your CFO, but plenty of space in our borrowing limit. Now, most of the time if we want to borrow, we have to get elector assent, I believe it's called. We have to ask the community if they're okay assenting to that debt. However, if you are at a significantly low point in your debt, you do have the opportunity to take on debt without that assent. We're getting pretty close to that level. We're very, very low in terms of debt. So your worship, that concludes the overview presentation. So we'll pause here if you, Councillor Public, has any questions.
And I have to unmute myself before I talk. So I have, so if I might ask council to refer to the financial plan or the presentation as you see fit. But I'm going to ask staff if we could put the call-in numbers up on the screen. If there's anybody from the public that wishes to call in at this point, you're welcome to do so. You can also call in as we go through the individual items as we go through this agenda tonight. So if you could put that up there, just people can call in and do that, or you can raise your hand within the Zoom app as well. And the raising the hand is just down at the bottom of the screen. It's under reactions. If you click that, you'll see a raise hand option, and just do that. And we'll unmute you and let you have a say to council and staff as well. So first I have Councillor Patterson and then Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you again, Mr. Payne, for the presentation. It's the more we go through it, the more we understand, but more questions too, probably. I just wanted to go back a little bit to some of your commentary on the reserve funds, which was quite thorough. But one thing I would like to know is for the sustainable funding, there is, as you have mentioned, there is nothing really defined yet for the facilities management or the buildings fund. And of course, it's not in the reserve fund listing. So I'd be interested in knowing if as that develops, if you would be proposing to have a building reserve fund as a separate component from all of the other reserve funds that are there. And on the facilities management, I was wondering, we're talking about a master plan, and I'm not quite clear on what the scope of that master plan would be providing to council, if it is meant to provide more detailed information on the scope of work and the costing for some of what was included in the Moore Wilson report, which was done in 2016 on all of the municipal buildings, or if in fact the facilities management report that will be coming out is intended to provide new information or alternatives to what was provided in the Moore Wilson report. And I also I read through what you have, the information that you have detailed very well in the report, but it's not clear what is factored into the 5-year plan for the buildings. I am assuming that there is nothing in there in the forecast on the 5-year plan for or maybe even a longer term plan for any major acquisitions or retrofits. And the reason I asked that question is because when I look at some of the building retrofits that we have been doing over the past 2 years, the costs that have come in for the actual work that has been done greatly exceeds what was in the Moore Wilson estimates for retrofitting buildings as outlined in their report. So kind of a big chunk of information, but I'm hoping that you can perhaps just, Mayor, through you to Mr. Payne, if you could just provide a bit broader view on what this budget does contain, or perhaps more specifically, what it doesn't contain.
Sure. Thank you very much, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Payne.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. So to answer your first question, Councillor Patterson, about the building reserves, what I'm probably going to propose to do, pending conversation with my peers on the leadership team, is have separate sub-reserves for every major asset class. So for instance, we have a reserve that resides in the Capital Works Reserve dedicated for water, right? And if we know what the annual funding for water main replacement is, then we can peg that reserve balance to that sustainable level. We can do that with every major class. Right now, frankly, the Capital Work Reserve provides a lot of detail for funds set aside for specific projects. My argument is if we're funding our assets sustainably, we don't need to dedicate portions of reserves to specific projects, because we will have overall sustainable funding for that asset class. I think that it simplifies things for everyone, for council, the public, and for staff. And that's probably what I will propose once we go down there and we understand what the sustainable funding is for every asset class. In terms of the facility master plan, I'm going to ask my colleague, Director Haran, to talk a bit about that and the scope of that project. And just to add a bit of information, we do have, we created a facilities capital program in the financial plan. It's embedded within the engineering and public works capital plan this year, which we do discuss next week. But it's really to set the stage for a more robust capital program, detailed capital program, because the work that's detailed in there right now, it's very modest. We've just got the municipal hall financial plan, some funds for structural repair at the marina, And that's basically it. So it's very not populated, and we expect it to be more further populated by that facilities master plan. So I'll ask Director Haran to add some comment.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Mr. Haran, welcome.
Yes, thank you. I'm just doing a radio check here. You can hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll try to address some of the questions that Councillor Patterson raised here, hopefully coherently. The first one is she mentioned a bit about reserves and capital funding set aside in terms of buildings and so on. And I just want to go back and mention that when these infrastructure renewal reserves were first contemplated back in 2017, 2018 timeframe, and the amounts and what they were for were first discussed, we did, the council discussed and staff advised that we didn't have the full answers to how much would need to be set aside to have sustainable, to replace infrastructure that needed replacing. We didn't have full plans in place. We didn't have all the answers. So the recommendations were done to set the capital funding aside as we develop our master plans and develop our how we're going to turn these ideas into something, into actual projects and sequencing. So that still is the case. We're still on that path going towards how do we best organize what the next 15, 20 years looks like. So that leads to the second part of the answer of what I had to say is the Moore-Wilson report, much like the Opus report done in 2015, 2016, they're just the first steps in our journey to modernize infrastructure, asset management, and capital improvement plans in Oak Bay. So they really did provide a real insight into the scope of the challenge in front of the community. But the real thing now is, so there's a bit of understanding of what the challenge is, a bit of planning and a bit of saving. But now, how do you turn that into multi-decade plans to sequence, to scope, and to fund those projects? And that's what the next steps in terms of facilities master plan is meant to do, is turn those ideas, those initial ideas in those reports, and start bringing them back to the community and to council to say, here are some options of which buildings are probably prioritized, how to fund those, what the scope of those projects might look like, and then really start setting putting some decisions in front of the council so that we can turn them into project charters and actually add them into a 5-year or 10-year financial plan. So instead of a broad, big picture without any focus, those master plans are meant to turn it into execution so we can start getting things done in the next few years. I hope that addresses the question.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. That I think it does indicate that we still have a lot of work to do on this, but it's helpful to know that definitely that it's in the crosshairs and that it is a priority to bring into the discussions for council to consider. One other item that through you to staff, I just would like a little more understanding on, and that is on page 74. Well, it was on page 74 of the version 1. So it's probably close to that in the new version, but it's about the fire machinery and equipment reserve fund, because that had a negative reserve balance projected. And it was projected that the negative balance would remain for many years until a sustainable reserve balance can be restored. And then when I look at the fire funding target for vehicles and equipment, it's got good in the asset replacement funding. So I'm having difficulty connecting those two concepts, one saying that it's in a negative balance and is significantly underfunded, and the other saying that the funding is good. So if I could get some clarification on that, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Payne?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, and an excellent question. So the fire equipment reserve is forecasted to go negative this year. And that's a result of purchasing the fire engine and then whenever we get the ladder truck as well. So really, when we buy that ladder truck, the fire equipment reserve is going negative and will remain negative for a number of years until those contributions catch it up. Now, the idea that the funding level is sustainable is separate from whether or not we have enough money in the reserve for current obligations. And I know that can be a little bit interesting. Essentially, what we're saying is that the contributions we've been putting aside for years were not enough to replace the fire equipment as it is now. Now we're setting aside the right amount. It's going to take decades to sustainably be at a positive area. But what we don't need to do is increase the annual funding, because the annual funding is the sustainable amount. It's just going to take some time to get into the positive territory.
Thank you, Mayor. That answers those questions right now, and I will turn it over to other councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you so much. Just a really quick question through you to Mr. Payne, and it's regarding page 11 of his presentation. I think I heard him say, and it's under the COVID-19 point, that 1.1 million Parks, Rec and Culture net revenues in 2020, and he forecasted a 1.5 million net revenues budgeted for 2021. But on the slide, it says minus 2.5. So I probably just heard him incorrectly, but if he could just clarify what that was, please.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, what I was referring to when I said 1.5 forecasted, at quarter 3, we had forecasted a 2020 actual financial result of negative $1.5 million, and it resulted in 1.1. We're forecasting for 2021 negative $2.5 million.
Perfect. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. You have Councillor Appleton and then Councillor Zelka.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to staff. I just wanted to ask a question just with regards to revenue more broadly. And in Mr. Payne's presentation, we're talking about the basically just under $1 million in fees and charges and developers' contributions that contribute to revenue. And if I do my course math right on this, just over, about 54 million or so in total revenue is about 1.5%. And I'm just wondering, it is very difficult, of course, to compare between different municipalities and different jurisdictions because the nature of their operations is so different. But I get the sense that that type of revenue as compared to the total operations of the district, as compared to other comparable municipalities, is quite low. And I may have that wrong, but perhaps the Director of Finance could sort of comment on basically there is going to be a more direct impact. And of course, he's made the point on several occasions that because we have a primarily residential tax base, that you do see these impacts more directly to the individual residential taxpayer. So I'm just wondering what that number looks like in comparison to other comparable municipalities and how that's impacting our revenue.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. And the slide that Councillor Appleton was referring to was the funding side of the equation for our capital over the next 5 years, so $84 million. And what we said was basically $900,000 are from fees and charges and developer contributions, and that's just for capital. Now, in reality, the portion of that from developer contributions is actually much lower than that. It's about $200,000. So remaining is fees and charges, and typically when the development community is providing revenue for capital, it's in the form of a DCC, which the district doesn't currently have a DCC bylaw. But that's not the driving reason. It's also the nature of the community that there isn't significant development underway. When you compare to a community that's not built out, you think of Langford or Colwood, where there's lots of unbuilt out land. Developer contributions for capital is significantly higher as a proportion of the total revenue. Now, keep in mind, we do have operating revenue from the development community, much of it being in building permit revenue, and that's closer to $1 million. It's about $900,000 annually. So over a course of 5 years, that's over $4 million in permits and fee revenue. I'm not sure if you're asking about that, but I thought I would just mention that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, and yeah, and thanks for the clarification on that, because I think I am conflating two different numbers. And thank you, Mr. Payne, because I do note the sort of $907,000 number for building and planning department revenue in the annual budget. So I appreciate that clarification. Yeah, thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Councillor Zelka.
Thank you. Mike Tech, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you, Councillor Zelka.
Wonderful, thank you. A couple of questions of clarification and then a question about revenue in general. The reserve, in the discussion that we had in the public hearing around the Monterey House that's used for Verks, there was a question of reserve funds that have been put aside for car parking over the years. I see in the list of reserve funds, no reserve called car parking. And I recall a year or so ago, we changed the name of one or two of these reserve funds. I was wondering if possibly you could highlight through you, a chair, to staff, which of these funds holds the monies that have been set aside for parking for cars?
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Mr. Payne.
Yes, Your Worship, Councillor Zelka is correct. We renamed the Village Parking Reserve and combined it with the Alternative Transportation Infrastructure Reserve, which is just below $1 million. So the fund still exists. The council did have a conversation about this, and to make it more understandable to the community, I think council is in agreement to make the name of that reserve more intuitive. So staff do have it as a housekeeping item in the next reserve bylaw amendment, just to rename it so that the vested interest in the community understand that the funds are still there and available for various capital.
Wonderful, thank you. Could you remind me, please, for the funds that we used to purchase the Monterey House, it wasn't taken out of this reserve funds. Could you remind me which reserve fund it was taken out of?
Mr. Payne.
Yes, Your Worship, it was the land sale reserve.
That's great. Thank you very much. The last question I have, at least for now, is a sort of a general question around revenue and I guess our policies around the use of something like parcel taxes. I note that monies have been set aside for the upland sewer separation, a service, I guess, that in some ways has to go into that unique part of Oak Bay in terms of separating the stormwater and the sewer lines in that area, but it's something that may not be, it certainly isn't applicable anywhere else in Oak Bay. Is staff considering the use going forward of a parcel tax for raising funds for the upland sewer separation, since we may not be able to get all of that granted through the province?
Your Worship,
I muted myself instead of unmuting myself. I've just said, go ahead, Mr. Payne.
thank you, Your Worship. To speak candidly, I don't believe that we have considered that. It's not an option that's off the table from the staff perspective in any way. The financial plan really contemplates using our gas tax reserve, which I believe is a result of previous council direction.
Mm-hmm.
So that would preclude the use of a parcel tax. However, if at some point we needed to borrow, it's something that's possible. I'm being told by my colleague, Director Haran, that council had decided that the whole district would cover the costs. So it seems to me that that would be subject to previous council direction. However, that direction could be changed if desired.
If I may continue?
Go ahead, Councillor Zelka.
Thank you. Yes, I do recall a previous council did touch upon that and did suggest that maybe all of Oak Bay would address it. But if I recall correctly at the time, certainly I didn't know anything about a parcel tax, and even the fact that the parcel tax was available to us as a possibility. And I do very much appreciate Appendix A in the new financial plan. It certainly clarified a lot of things for me with respect to parcel taxes and our current policies. And it does seem that I'm hoping, I don't know whether it'll be part of the sewer master plan or whether this will be part of some future financial plan, but I think it would be useful, and I do look forward to finding a way for us to have a good discussion about whether parcel taxes will be applicable and available and useful for Oak Bay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Sorry, I'm keep on bumping my my button here. I'm going to take your comment and just make a question to Mr. Payne on that. I think at some point we've talked about this in the past about the possibility of having a more fulsome discussion to give some policy direction on these sorts of things in terms of how capital improvements are made, whether that's a frontage tax, a parcel tax, borrowing, reserve growth, etc. So, in your mind, Mr. Payne, where would that conversation start to happen as we are ramping up these capital projects and are contemplating that longer term infrastructure plan? Where would you see that governance lens would kick in, where we would start giving some direction in terms of some of those tools?
Your worship, well, the question of how to fund the upland sewer separation will certainly come up when we receive the decision from the provincial federal government as to the status of our application. That might be a good opportunity at that point. I can't remember what the grant stipulations are. Perhaps the grant stipulations are that we do use a reserve, but that doesn't mean that we can't replenish a reserve using a parcel tax or some other method. So that would be a good time. I would advise council that if that's something important to them to revisit how that gets funded, it would be a good idea to provide some direction to staff to bring options surrounding that. But I think council will have the opportunity, because nonetheless you'll be advised of the results of the grant application.
Sure, and I guess, and I'll go back to Councillor Zelka in a second. I just want to caution, mooting ideas on these sort of things too much without having some direction or more fulsome, because obviously those decisions have substantial impact on people's costs. And I'm sure if they got wind that suddenly we were mooting a change of direction on that without some more contemplation, that would no doubt result in some people coming to us and demanding to get answers on why. If you don't mind, Councillor Zelka, I'm just going to ask Mr. Horan. And I believe I remember the answer to this question, but what is the direction currently on funding? Because I understand that the homeowners in the uplands would pay the substantive part of their lateral costs, and we would provide a bit of a discount to incent them to hook up as we're doing the work. Am I remembering that correctly in terms of what the current expectation is in the uplands?
Yes, Your Worship. The direction was definitely so it was discussed and deliberated, and when finally the decision about what to build to separate combined sewers and how to fund it in terms of what portion was going to be private property portion and what portion was going to be public property, and the amounts that those were expected to be back in 2016. And then subsequently in the different portions in the last few years when we've done grant applications or brought back updated estimates, all along it's been a capital cost of a certain amount of money for the whole project. The latest estimate that we used for the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program grant was 22 million. And that amount was 22 million funded by the district as a whole. But then to touch on, so that's the decision that the council has made consistently related to that specific project. But to talk about projects in general, this is part of what comes out of this master planning process for whatever assets we're talking about. So if we're talking about storm sewer master plan, facilities master plan. So when we bring to the council some details about here are the capital works that are intended for the next 20 or 30 years, and here's what they cost, that's when the council gets to also weigh in on how to fund them, and then the decisions on who benefits from the assets versus whether it's a specific street or neighborhood or whether it's the whole community. Those are the kinds of things that get decided in the master planning process. So that's coming for most of the asset classes, and it's not information that we've typically needed or had been forced to decide in the past, but now that the amount of work that's coming down in the near future in terms of infrastructure renewal, this will definitely be front and center in terms of discussions of what the future looks like.
Okay, thank you. I didn't mean to take over Councillor Zelka. I just thought it would be worth clarifying that particular question since it was open. And back to you. Do you have any further questions?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, by the way, very much for drilling down just a little bit further in the areas that I would like us to at least talk about. And I agree with you. This is not intended to be a surprise or to spring an idea like this on anyone, but it's a valid idea and it's something that we have available to us. So I appreciate the fact that whether it'll be within the master plans or when we find out about grants that we either get or don't get, and then we have to possibly look at the $22 or $25 million or whatever the total cost may end up being in the end, finding appropriate ways of funding that. I just wanted to also put a plug in for the the finance committee that's been discussed in the past, but that might be a place to also talk about these sorts of things. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Councillor Zelka. I saw Councillor Braithwaite, your hand go up briefly. Did you have something to add?
No, sorry, Mayor, I actually lost my connection briefly when Mr. Payne was answering the question that that Councillor Zelka had asked, and I was just wondering if I missed anything that Mr. Haran didn't cover.
Okay. Are you satisfied at this point? You're okay? Okay. I'm going to go just before I go to the public, and just again, to the public can now hit *9 to raise your hand if you wish to speak at this point. I will call on you multiple times throughout this evening. Councillor Green, though, I don't want to ignore you. Is there any questions that you might have at this point following the presentation?
Thank you very much, Mayor. No questions, just a comment. I really appreciate that Mr. Payne took the time to include the tax increase dollar amount to median residential property as stated on page 33 of the report, version 2. I'm very grateful for that. I think it really helps to translate what the percentages mean for taxpayers, and they seem to understand dollars and cents a little more than they do percentages, but I do appreciate it. Thank you very much, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I get Ms. Morden. I think you're managing the call-in lines. Is there anybody who's raised their hands?
No one has joined the Zoom meeting by phone or browser, Your Worship.
Okay, no problem. And again, if you're watching and you wish to ask questions as we go through each section, you are absolutely welcome to do so. I will make the same call each time that we have a section. And if you miss that and you want to go backwards, you can also just speak to an earlier topic as well at any point. So I just, the point here is that we're trying to get questions and thoughts out that can help us make wise decisions going forward on this budget process. So feel free at any point to jump in. We are now next on the revenue presentation and discussion. Seems appropriate given the conversation we were just having.
Thank you, Your
Go ahead,
Worship.
Mr.
I'm
Payne.
just going to share my screen here and we're talking about revenue. So for those watching at home, this is on page 28 of the version 2 of the financial plan. And I believe you can all see my screen now. It says consolidated financial plan. I'm just going to speak briefly about some of the variances here and pause. And if council has any questions, more than happy to answer. One of the first things I want to touch on was the new construction property tax revenue, also known as new development tax revenue. This essentially is tax that's derived from properties that didn't exist last year. So if a property was subdivided this year in 2020, those two properties didn't exist in 2020. They do exist in 2021. It's brand new revenue to the district, and the district can use that in many ways. Previously, the district would reduce the tax impact, but last year council resolved to use the funds here to bolster the infrastructure, the transfer to reserve for infrastructure. The principle there being that if our community develops, there's new infrastructure to serve new customers. Let's call them customers or residents. And there's also more funding needed for existing services to provide the same service level. So, you know, for every every increase of 400 residents, perhaps we need a new police officer to provide the same level of service. That's the principle behind it. So staff recommend reserving that to bolster operating funds for existing services or capital for existing capital. That's what we've done. We've integrated this increase into our transfer to reserve budget. And since it's budgeted to be $200,000, that's $1 million increase to our reserves over the 5-year period. So that helped reduce the impact from our investment returns dropping. So I'm just gonna, I just wanted to remind council of that, because it's not a policy set in stone, and council staff can receive a different direction from council on that if they wish. The next revenue item here I want to talk about was the boulevard frontage tax. We've pegged the increase to this tax to the same increase that occurred in the boulevard frontage, the boulevard maintenance fees in the Parks Rec and Culture budget. So the increase here will always be relative to the increase in cost in the boulevard maintenance. That program, some folks benefited from it directly, so they're charged a boulevard frontage tax, but there's many general boulevards in the district that are funded from general taxation. The next revenue item I want to talk about here was just the operating grants here. We've shown the COVID-19 restart grant in the financial plan here. It's about $2.5 million. However, in accounting reality, it's actually earned revenue from last year, so it exists in our reserves. Yeah, I won't bore, I can see the mayor's laughing. I won't bore anybody with that, but I wanted to show it here for transparency to the public that we're using those funds to support operations. The capital grants portion is a significant increase. That's in anticipation and an optimistic, hopeful anticipation for the Upland Sewer Separation Grant. There's also $550,000 there for the Todd House Phase 2. I haven't heard back. We have not integrated any grant for the chiller, but the Parks Rec and Culture chiller, we have submitted a grant application for that. The developer contribution here, this is the Bowker Collection Development Community Amenity Contribution, and it's meant for the Bowker-Cadborough Bay Road intersection improvements. So they provided an amenity contribution specifically for that project. And that project has been integrated into the capital plan and engineering. So we'll talk about that plan next year. Next meeting on the 18th. The investment income, we've talked about this quite a bit to death. We're expecting a decrease significantly. But I just also wanted to mention to council, because it was of interest before, that 20% of our portfolio right now is invested in the MFA fossil fuel free bond fund, which is about $9 million. And the final couple things here to discuss is the facilities department revenue. We have anticipated a drop in our Oak Bay Marina lease revenue, the portion of the lease revenue that's based on their revenue. So if they don't meet their sales targets, then we get a smaller portion of their lease revenue. So we've anticipated that. After that, the RFP for the lease is underway at the moment, so we don't really know what the lease revenue will look like in 2022 and beyond. So we've just kind of kept it status quo in the financial plan. And then lastly, the building and planning department revenue. We're going to talk about this a bit more when we get to the building and planning operating budget today. I think as I showed last year, the department revenue was at its historical high in the budget. So we're kind of scaling it back to a historical average. And if we exceed that amount, we'll probably recommend that anything that exceeds that historical average get sent into a reserve so that we don't become tax dependent on that, and it increases our taxes as a result. So this year it's a $68,000 drop, and we are, part of the tax increase is a result of that being integrated into the financial plan. Mind you, when we get to the operating budget of the building and planning department, council will see there was actually a substantial increase to revenue this year compared to last year, but it still never met budget, what we had for budget. So I'll stop there, Your Worship, for questions, and just a reminder that the next topic would then be the Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there questions of council on these items? Perhaps we can put up the numbers again for the public, if any of the members of the public wish to call and ask questions about this. And I'll give them a minute. I don't see any hands up. Councillor Green, did you have any questions or comments?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Okay, we'll just wait a minute to see if there's anybody from the public that wishes to address council on this portion of the presentation on their revenues. Ms. Morden, has there been anybody raise hands?
No hands raised, your worship.
Virtual hands? No? Okay. Then why don't we move on at this point? Sorry, just Mr. Payne, just for my clarification, you suggested we have the discussion on the Chamber of Commerce at this point?
Yeah, Your Worship, I think it's a good place if council wanted to provide further direction.
It is not currently in. I'm just looking at the expenses because it's not in here as a line item. Is that correct?
Correct. It would just be integrated into the membership dues and fees in the corporate admin budget, which we went over yesterday. But it's so minor that it hasn't been separated like that.
No, fair enough. I'm just wondering if it might be a simpler discussion as part of our grant discussion. I anticipate our grants are going to be lower than traditional this year as well, and might be easy in that consideration to be considered in there. But I feel like that's one of those things that we're going to have to kind of, looking at the overall budget amount, if we're going to take that out of the provisional budget, then we should consider that a bit later in the process. That's all I'm thinking. But I'll take council's direction on this. If council wishes to make a motion to include it, we can do that, and we could then remove it if anybody wishes to later as well. Councillor Braithwaite.
Yeah, just a quick question there. If we included it in the grants, through the grants process, would it then not have to come back every year?
Yes.
Okay, but just like it would for, like for example, SIP has to come back in this case every 5 years because it's a 5-year, commitment to SIP, is it not?
Yes,
Yeah,
although
okay.
I don't think it's a binding commitment. The expectation
Right.
is if you sign up, you're in for the 5 years.
Okay, so I mean, I'm not sure where the right place for this would be. I'm quite happy to make a motion as per Mr. Payne's suggestion. So maybe we'll try that first and see how it goes. So I'll move that staff be directed to register the district as a member of the Greater Victoria Chamber of Commerce.
Is there a seconder for that motion?
I'll second it for discussion.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Councillor Braithwaite, given the hesitancy to second, you better motivate here.
Sure. I just going back to Mr. Williams' presentation that he did for us on Monday at our council meeting. I just think that membership into the chamber kind of gives us a few things, and that would really be beneficial, I think, to the district. And also, he did mention that there's a lot of the other municipalities have become members, and so it would show a little bit of solidarity alongside them. And he mentioned that Victoria, Saanich, Esquimalt, View Royal, Colwood, Langford, and the CRD are all members. And it would add our voice to advocacy that they do with the federal and provincial governments. I think that what really kind of did it for me as well is that he talked about it being more of a regional chamber of commerce, and that the advocacy that they're doing around childcare, Indigenous, climate change, etc., kind of really spoke to me. So I would hope that that it would be something that our council could get behind. It's similar to me with our SIP membership in that it's a real showing, like he said, regional just to be something more regional and to show, to kind of put our voices and our advocacy regionally rather than just on our own. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Councillor Green as the seconder, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I'm pleased to have the discussion. I would be interested to hear what my other colleagues say as well. I think for me, as the liaison to BIA and then to tourism, this could be very helpful to our local small businesses, and tourism if we broaden the network of support, which I gathered from Mr. Williams' presentation was something that they are trying to do. And I know what a struggle it is for our small business locally and also tourism locally. It's a really tough time, and I think I've said this before, and Councillor Braithwaite and before Councillor Braithwaite, Councillor Appleton as alternates, they also are aware of how difficult it's been. So if there is, and I struggle with it, but if there is an advantage to membership with the Chamber, and I think Councillor Braithwaite's point about a more regional focus and the fact that other municipalities, and they're all smaller than, they're all on the small side as well, some of them, it may be an advantage. But again, I would like to hear what colleagues are saying or thinking rather. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to look for hands, and I don't see any yet. I have Councillor Appleton. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I certainly would support the motion in principle. I do think it's a good idea, and I do think there's lots of benefits that would accrue from that. I do concur with the idea of potentially initially establishing it on a bit of a time frame. I do like the fact, I think that there's lots of benefits that come out of the SIP partnership for sure, but I also feel good about the fact that it sort of comes up on a periodic renewal so that we can evaluate it and evaluate the benefit to the district. So I'm not sure whether there's an ability to sort of amend this. I think this is what you were speaking to as far as having it go into the grant category, but certainly I don't know whether it's possible to amend the existing motion to incorporate a time frame or whether it should just be bumped over to the grants.
Sure, and I might go to Mr. Payne on this one, just in terms of simplicity. If the council's intention is to, try this, but on a time-limited basis to see the net benefit and value, is that better done in the grant program where we're forced to look at it on an annual basis, or to modify this motion in a way that brings it back for consideration next year or 2 years from now, whatever council sees fit? Mr. Payne, any suggestions on that?
Your Worship, absent of direction, typically we would just integrate the funding into our annual financial plan. But if there's just general direction from the table here, I'm more than happy just to bring it back for reconsideration annually. If I get that general direction from the table, I don't need a specific motion to say that. Happy to do that.
I think it would be annually for a short time. I think once we we would make that determination. I think one of the things we've got bogged down in the past is in budget discussions is that we have these small things that happen every year, and we've had debates on them every year as they reiterate. And so I think integrating it makes sense in the long run, but I think in the short run, so Councillor Appleton, does that answer satisfy your concerns?
Thank you, Worship, and I would concur with that. Is that I think it would be to be revisited in the short term with the idea of demonstrating the benefit, which I think is probably going to be demonstrated, and then incorporating it as an ongoing budget item. So yeah, if that's possible, then that's great.
Thank you, Councillor Ney, then Councillor Patterson.
Well, my comments were actually very similar to Councillor Appleton. I just would like a little bit more staying in touch with sort of the performance review kind of thing about what exactly they are doing year by year. Because we got a very long list of many initiatives that they were involved in. I just like to hear more detail. I have a sense that this is a really good kind of initiative to support where they're trying to network and create partnerships throughout the region, particularly during this difficult time. So, but I would just like a little bit more staying in touch, at least initially. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Ney. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. And I think my comments are much the same as the last two councillors who spoke. In general, I have favorable regard for local chambers of commerce because I think they do play a very important role in locally and regionally. There may be a little overlap between the Chamber of Commerce here and SIPS, who also does a phenomenal job at promoting the region and business in the region. But I too would like to see kind of a check-in on this in the future, because there's two sides to this. The chambers can provide certainly the opportunity for council and district staff to, they generally will have very good speaker programs. And so it's a great way to gain knowledge in a broader perspective, and for a consolidated voice to lobby for efforts. But they also have a real positive platform for networking of small businesses. And so I would be very interested to hear, as time goes on, from Councillors Braithwaite and Green, and I believe Councillor Appleton was involved also with the BIA, as to if this also encourages their participation in the chamber and the positive benefits that might result in that. So I think that there's, there are a few dimensions to this that could be of benefit to the community, but it is something that is good. Typically, in most municipalities, and I know I was a member at the chamber in my former location for many years, and they can tend to just run and run and run without really evaluating the benefits. And so that check-in would be a very good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson.
Projected tax increase this very second, unless we add something else, is 6.49%. I'm not in favor of adding anything else to the tax load at this time. Possibly next year or the year after, when the taxes are expected to be less, I would certainly consider it. And I would also like just to review it maybe on a year-by-year basis until we can be assured of the value to Oak Bay and the Oak Bay residences. So that's where I would sort of add in terms of the value. So for the motion as it stands, I'll have to vote against. I do note that the Chamber of Commerce has a position in favor of amalgamation, which kind of turned me against the Chamber, unfortunately. But I am very much in favor of the work that SIP is doing, and I'm very thrilled with our support for business in that respect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Zelka. I don't see any other hands. Councillor Green, anything else to add just before I?
Well, just really quickly, to my knowledge, Catherine Holt, the last CEO of the Chamber, really created a very strong foundation and moved it more into the sort of social issues realm of the work they do. And Mr. Williams, of course, comes as the former CEO of SIPS. So I think this chamber in particular has taken a bit of a direction that is far more supportive of local business and economies, but also concerned about social issues like housing, healthcare, and public health. So I'm inclined to support this. I do agree that we can come back each year and look at it, but I do think in the end there is value. And just finally, I'll say that for taxpayers, without local businesses and a strong local economy here in Oak Bay, that will impact all of us. So if there's anything else we can do to support the local economy here and local businesses through a very difficult time, I think this would be a great thing to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Green. I don't see any other hands up here, so I'm ready to call the question. All those in favor? And those opposed? And Councillor Green?
Yes, I'm in favor.
So Register Councillor Zelka opposed. Thank you. So that motion passes. Any other points or questions before we move on past this section? I'm not seeing any, so I'm happy to move to the next, which is the operating budget presentation on finance and IT.
Your worship, I'm just sharing my screen here. We're at page 49 of the financial plan version 2.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. So I'll just talk about a couple things real quick here, introduce some of the accomplishments, things that are planned next year, and a bit on the operating budget. So last year, the investment policy, expense reimbursement policy, budget transfer policy, and reserve bylaw were rewritten. We had a lot of help from our contracted IT managed services through the Office 365 transition, which was critical for shifting to a COVID world. So it wasn't without its challenges. And coupled with that was a very extensive PC replacement plan. I'm very pleased the progress we made on our payroll implementation phase 1 is complete. It's very promising. The staff guided us through an online tax deferment transition, which was difficult for our residents, but I do believe they worked very closely with our residents to make that as easy as possible. And we also introduced a payment for our accounts payable via EFT system, so it saved us a lot of money and time and process on our payments. In 2021, we're looking to deliver the infrastructure replacement plan in cooperation with the other departments, in particular the engineering department. We'd like to do that in fall of 2021. The official timeline in the strategic priorities list is 2022 fall, but we just think it's a critical piece for council to consider for the long-term budget. I'd like to conduct a parking services review, finish a payroll transition, and review some of the IT policies. We'd also like to do utility billing and process review and conduct a network security audit this year. So if I could draw council's attention to the operating budget and the finance general section there, you'll notice the staff are proposing a $34,000 increase, so 4.1% to finance general. Approximately $24,000 of that is just forced growth for salary and benefits. There's no increase to professional development or travel, training, materials and supplies, dues, or anything like that. There is $10,000 increase proposed for vacation coverage, overtime, and acting pay. You'll notice last year we came in over budget on that by about $15,000. That was mainly due to a vacancy we had in a key position in our department, and we really had no choice but to staff that or significantly impact service levels. So that $10,000 that's being proposed is to provide the flexibility for that and for staff to do some overtime to continue the pace of achievement in the department. Parking services, we've recommended a 3% increase, even though the contract that we have actually keeps the cost static. We do anticipate a new competition for parking enforcement due this year. So we just wanted to keep the funding growing at a reasonable pace so that there isn't a sharp increase, assuming that there is an increase after the competition. In terms of the IT department, there's just some contractual increases to our ERP licensing. For instance, Tempus and Vadim are our major ERP systems, and they're both going up 5%, but that's tempered by lower increases elsewhere. So that's the entirety of the the finance and IT operating budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Are there any questions on this area? And perhaps I can get you to put up the phone numbers again, Ms. Morden, in case anybody of the public wishes to have questions on here. Seeing anything from Councillor Green? Any questions on this section?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Morden, is there anybody that is raising their hand either within Zoom or on the phones to speak to this item?
No hands raised, Your Worship.
Okay. I do know, just for council's comfort, we've had a few people who have indicated they wanted to come and speak. Most of them, all of them, to my knowledge, have indicated they're going to come to the next budget meeting where we're talking about some of the other items that are coming up at that anticipated meeting. So go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor. and through you to staff. Just curious here where it said rewrite district's IT policies. I mean, we hear so much about, municipalities, all kinds of hospitals, government sources being hacked and whatnot. And so I'm wondering, this is policies, and so it may be a different matter, but I'm wondering if perhaps Mr. Payne could comment on just issues around increasing security for IT systems.
Mr. Payne?
Yes, Your Worship. We actually have a draft IT policy prepared, recently prepared in this year, 2021. The policy does address some techniques, let's say, to support IT security, appropriate use and use of passwords, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all well and good, and they're foundational pieces in the IT policy, but really our best defense against vulnerabilities is the human element and training in the human element. So you'll notice in the financial plan a couple things to support that. The security audit is one thing, so that will audit our hardware, but it will also audit human behavior. Last year we purchased this a phishing testing suite. We actually did conduct a phishing test on the organization. Most people were unaware of that. We're going to do that again to form a baseline, and then once we have established a good baseline of the human behavior here, we can aim for improvement through proactive training. So that's really our best line of defense. In the capital budget, there are pieces that will support security as well, but hardware is only as good as the humans that are using the hardware.
Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Payne. I don't see any other hands. Any members of the public? Again, I'll just ask Ms. Morden to have raised their hands on this item.
No hands raised, Your Worship.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I believe that allows us to move on to the fire and emergency services portion. Mr. Payne, are you there? This would be page, for those following along, 53 on the agenda package.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was rambling away with the mute button on. So thank you. Yes, Your Worship, we're on page 53 of the financial plan. Some of the accomplishments from 2020, the fire department obviously played a foundational role in the operational support of the EOC last year. Certainly a lot of leadership coming out of that division for our EOC. They managed to paint their interior, prepare an emergency evacuation plan, a fire underwriter survey was conducted, and they installed a fire hall alerting system, which is well integrated with our partners, the District of Saanich. In 2021, they want to complete the procurement of the engine with light rescue. So that would be significant. There's a couple moving pieces there. We'll talk about it when we get to council. But they also need to begin the procurement of the ladder truck and prep the site for the portable apparatus base. So those three pieces have to be considered in unison, which there will be significant discussion about that. They want to replace the emergency generators and complete the fire master plan. When we look at the proposed increase in the financial plan, there's a $79,000 increase. Keep in mind, this does not include contemplation of collective agreement increase. That is integrated elsewhere in the financial plan, mind you, so it is covered off elsewhere. The majority of the $79,000 is just staffing increments and benefits. Keep in mind, WCB rates have gone up significantly this year, superannuation, other things like that. So that's about $50,000 of that $79,000. Also, $15,000 has been integrated in there for the mutual aid and auto aid costs. We don't know how much that's going to cost us annually. That was an estimate prepared by the chief. He was thinking around $30,000. So we opted to put in $15,000 this year, see what happens. And if we need to increase the remaining $15K next year, that's what we'll do. And there's also a slight increase to overtime, $5,000 there, and some additional licensing for the fire alerting system that was just installed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Payne. Are there any questions on the fire services? And again, if we can just bring up the phone numbers, I'll ask the public as well in a minute. Any members of council? And we have Chief Hughes here as well to answer any questions. Councillor Patterson, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. This is, you know, an area that I expressed concern in the last budget period with the portable garage, I will say, for lack of a better word, to house the new fire truck. You know, just, and I take it if there is to be more reporting on this, but I am not, I can't say that I either support or don't support the budget at this point in time, pending, you know, further information on how it will work from a building code, fire code, emergency services operation, and really how it will operate at the site. I mean, it is obvious from the financial plan this year that our fire services, the review of both the facilities and the equipment is perhaps long past due. And but you know, I would like to really have a better understanding what the scope of the project is and the benefit to us, the expected longevity of it, and then how we move forward on planning for the future of protective services from the fire department in the district. I certainly know that our Oak Bay Fire Department has support from all of the community, I would say, but I think that needs to be reflected in the recognition of what it takes by way of the facilities and the equipment to actually maintain the first quality service that our firefighters certainly are trained to provide for the community. But the good firefighting department is really only as good as the facilities and the equipment that they have to service it. So I'd like to have a much broader understanding, in-depth understanding of how this will work on the site, and that it will satisfy the services to the district of our fire department. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Would you like an update from Chief Hughes at this point in terms of what the plans are for the site and what the current and the process that's going to be undertaken in terms of the determination of the siting, et cetera, for the new bay, should it go forward?
I think that would be helpful, just to see what the next steps are, so that we really have a better understanding at council of what is planned, how it will look, how it will operate, and what we as a council need to move forward with. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Patterson. Chief Hughes, we have questions for you. So could you indulge us a little bit and just give us an overview of what's happening and the process that would be undertaken particularly on the bay, but anything else that's happening as well?
Yes, Your Worship. As through Your Worship to council, as Director Payne had mentioned, there's a lot of integrated parts here. Clearly, the apparatus bay, the portable apparatus bay, is one of the largest. It would be the most visually impactful, as well as operation. I think probably the visual impacts, depending on the options that we selected, and there'll be a much more fulsome, a consultation with council and information as to the options on placement of this. But we have narrowed down the locations from an operational perspective, and it will be up to council to decide on and the public where that is going to be located. We have looked at the various areas that we can place the portable apparatus bay, and from an operational perspective, it shouldn't be too difficult. The portable apparatus bay is really a stopgap measure based on the age of the building. And we call it temporary, but from a building and planning point of view, it's certainly not considered temporary in that aspect, as it would be, I would think at least 5 years before there's contemplation of a new fire station. But again, I leave that with council. But we'll have a lot more information forthcoming. But the bay, more than likely, we've got about we have 2 sites that we bring to council, 2 locations on site, and there'll be just a decision that has to be made around both aesthetics and operations at that point.
Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, Mayor, thank you for that information. And if I could have a follow-up, just if we could confirm that whether we are in fact working with a consultant, maybe perhaps a professional engineer who has expertise in emergency type buildings that is giving us advice on this.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Your
No,
Worship.
go ahead, Chief.
The Zoom throws me off a little bit, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Patterson, yes, we're engaging professional engineers as well as on site to do mock-ups and whatnot of what things will look like. So it won't be the fire chief's rendition of what the building will look beside the fire hall.
Thank you, Mayor. That's all the questions I have. And thank you, Chief.
I had this image of Chief Hughes drawing a picture of a building and holding it out to us, the council, to say this is basically what it'll look like. So that's encouraging. Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm hoping that I might ask a question of the chief since he's here from page 52 of the financial plan, where there's some performance measures and statistics. There's a couple of that just jumped out to me. Would it be appropriate for me to ask at this time?
Yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time on
Okay.
these, but I think it's brief questions are acceptable.
Sure.
For sure. Go ahead.
Just very, very quickly, through you to Chief Hughes, just looking at the numbers of the responses to requests for assistance medical, which were less than half of what they were in 2019. And so if you can touch on that one, and then also the average response time, I noticed that it did go up by about 26 seconds from last year. And just wondering if there's something that you can tell us about that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Chief Hughes.
Through your worship, yes. So the medical calls were a result of the province changing the dispatch protocols, and lower acuity calls were not coming through to the department for medical aid calls, and that was to protect the supplies of PPE for the care workers in the hospital, and the average response time, as you could see the dip. Yes, and again, COVID-related response, as our people were suiting up, looking at masking, being much more deliberate for many calls. And it slowed us down slightly, but it was necessary.
Yeah, no, that's what I thought it was probably going to be. So thank you very much for that explanation.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Any other questions? I'll go to Councillor Green. Anything for you?
No, I don't think so. All of my questions have been asked. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Ms. Morton, has been any calls or hands raised from the public on this item?
No calls and no hands raised, Your Worship.
Okay, again, anybody can raise a point backwards if they wish, although our fire chief may be leaving us, I don't know, as we go through the rest of the evening, but certainly the financial questions are still very answerable, and we can always get back to people if they have them. Next up on the agenda, we are on item number, so I'm just going to go 5.3, the Building and Planning Department, and go ahead, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Your Worship. So just sharing page 56 of the financial plan, which is the Building and Planning operating budget. Last year, some of the accomplishments in that division, the division actually managed to increase revenues by about $150,000 from compared to 2019, despite being short staff for the entirety of the year. So that was significant, considering that shed some light on challenges, resourcing challenges. the housing needs report was completed. The Community Climate Action Working Group was supported. Step 3 of the BC Energy Step Code was implemented, and the draft strategy for secondary suites was also completed. Excuse me for just a moment there. So just to look at some of the operating budget changes that we have here. So the planning division of the operating budget has been reduced by restructuring 0.5 in the plans examiner position. And the bylaw enforcement division has increased by 0.5 per council's direction during the 2020 financial plan process. So we had originally anticipated that the net increase for this department would be a 0.5. However, the department was able to restructure and support the envelope funding for the staff restructuring corporate wide. So the leadership team prioritized staff funding across the organization, and part of that was from this department reducing the plans examiner position by 0.5. The department has indicated that it might be a required resource moving forward, so we're still working on the final structure of the staffing there. However, I just wanted to note that there. So other than that, there's a very modest increase of $1,200 being asked, and that would conclude the presentation for this operating budget item. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. If we can just put the phone numbers up again, Ms. Morden. I'll take any questions from members of council at this time. I guess technically members of the committee at this time. We are sitting as committee of the whole tonight. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, and what I hope is a simple question that I think I already know the answer to, but the climate action grants and rebates are related, I believe, are the line item from Community Climate Action Work Group, and they're just being, that's a holdover, right, in terms of just going from 30,000 in the 2020 budget to 2021. It's a rollover.
Mr. Payne.
Your Worship, that program is perpetually integrated into the financial plan, so every year there will be 30 grand to be used. And we're proposing that if those funds don't get spent, like they were not spent in 2020, because the grant program hasn't been developed, that they roll into the climate action reserve so they can continue to provide that. And just to add a bit of context and history there, recall that we were able to reduce the engineering budget last year because of the energy savings from the LED light program. And that's what created the funding for this program. So it was a good result there.
Great. Thank you, Councillor. Anything else?
Thank you. No, thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you. Mine is a question, again, on one of the charts. I noticed that on page 55 under 2020 accomplishments, it talks about implementing the Prospect Heritage Conservation Area. But when I go and look on page 54 under performance measurement statistics, I'm surprised that I don't see that there, because I would hope that in the future that we'll have another HCA. So I'm wondering if it would be beneficial to perhaps add the HCA under performance measurement statistics, or if there's a reason that it's not there.
Sure. I think that'd be a question for Mr. Anderson. Is Mr. Anderson on the call?
Yes, Your Worship.
Welcome. And for those watching at home, Mr. Anderson is our Director of Building and Planning. Welcome, Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. The Heritage Conservation Area, it's not really in the category of a statistic, if you will, that we would measure. Those are primarily around permits and applications and items of that nature, rather than, I guess, amendments to the community plan, such as an HCA. So I think it would be perhaps just marked as an accomplishment in a more significant way than a statistic on the table. I hope that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And going to Councillor Zelka.
Thank you, Chair. If I can surmise where Councillor Braithwaite may be going in the future, I would definitely support her on the application or the establishment of future HCAs. So I do look forward to seeing this as being something to celebrate going forward. But my question was actually not a question. It's more of a sincere thanks to the department for holding the line on FTEs and for rejigging the bylaw compliance officer aspects and the building and plans examiner aspects. Thank you so much for doing that. I think that was quite appropriate, and I'm very pleased. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Zelka. And I think we're going to try and make that work. That's how that's laying out. Is there any other questions of Councillor Green?
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of questions under staffing history and forecasted requests. I just wondered, through you, Mayor, if Mr. Anderson could describe to me what a building official 2 is and what a building official 1 is. I know one of them has to do with bylaw, and I was just wondering what building official 2 is, what those responsibilities involve. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Green. Probably a few people have seen those and wondered what they actually were in the context. Mr. Anderson, do you mind giving a quick synopsis of those 2 positions?
Certainly, Your Worship. Thank you. So the building officials are, those are actually, I guess, sequential positions. In other words, the building official 1 is at a level 1 of the building expertise, and you'll note that that's also currently a shared role with bylaw enforcement. But our building official level 2, that's our more senior building inspector with a higher level of accreditation and responsibility in terms of delivering that service for the community. So it's basically a seniority and a difference in positions as you work your way through your different levels of competency in the building inspection world. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Green. You had said you had another question?
Yes, thank you. I just a comment, and I appreciate the explanation, but I'm looking under performance measures and stats, building inspections running around well over 2,000. And I'm just wondering, do you feel that you have any capacity issues in the building official category? Just a question.
Mr. Anderson?
Through you, Mayor. I'm sorry, to Mr. Anderson.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, our building officials are very high performers. I'm just going to congratulate them for their level of effort in terms of, especially in the context of last year. But what we have is we are having one of our building officials carry out much of the plan check items as well in the absence of the plans examiner. So they are kind of stepping a bit above and beyond. But I think in terms of the future, and if we were to maintain the level of applications that we're seeing, that we might want to look toward perhaps considering some plan check function being added in. But at this point, I think with 2 building officials, if we can convert to having a bylaw enforcement officer take some of that bylaw function away from one of our building officials, I think we'll be in pretty good shape for the next year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I have Councillor Patterson and Zelka.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through to you to staff. This is also about performance measures and statistics. I'm wondering if the Director of Planning could perhaps give us a comment on the turnaround time for an average building application in the district. I noticed some other districts, they talk about turnaround time and whatnot. And so I'm just wondering, we do have a relatively small staff. I know if my very casual survey of the community lately, it has any accuracy, there's a lot of construction going on. So if the Director of Building and Planning could give us an indication of what their response is in terms of getting the applications approved.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Patterson. It's an excellent question and ties directly to sort of our governance oversight in terms of our service levels expected. So, Mr. Anderson, can you speak to that?
Yeah, primarily I'll speak to perhaps a new home building permit application, which is a little more significant perhaps than say a plumbing permit or a smaller application. But what we've been looking at and trying to sort of keep in step with is the idea that upon receipt of an application, we would see the issuance of a permit within about a 6 to 8 week time frame. We've been much quicker in years past, and also we've been also much slower in years past. So I think we're on average we're around the 8 week category of those more significant building permits.
And just to follow up, if I may, Mayor, on that, that sounds relatively good, I suppose, to me, but I'm not a building and planning expert. So perhaps how does that stack against other communities, say within the CRD, other smaller communities? Is that a something that the Director of Building and Planning feels comfortable with?
Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, I don't have comparisons of other communities at the top of my mind at the moment, but I think in terms of a reasonable time frame and response, that is a good target for us in terms of that sort of 6 to 8 week time frame. I'm sure some would prefer it to be 2 weeks, but there's certainly some diligence needs to go into issuing building permits. So thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Not seeing any. I just, one other question I would have just ties to the question raised by a couple of councillors, most recently Councillor Patterson on that though, are there other aspects of investment that council could support to say automate some of the processes for smaller permit applications online, for instance, or other tools that could be used to free up the staff to do the more complicated asks in future, Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Your Worship, for the question. One thing I can mention is with the COVID, it kind of moved us toward a more electronic and digital processing of all our application types, but particularly for building permits, we switched over and we started to use what's referred to as Bluebeam technology in terms of plan reviews. And so I think in many respects, we've adapted and have the electronic tools in place for this, and then it's a matter of making sure that we've got our staff trained to fully make use of that and have staff in place to in fact make use of that. So I think we're in pretty good shape on the moving toward the electronic review of building permits.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, hands raised, so I'll go to Ms. Morden. Is there anybody from the public that is raising their hand and wishing to speak?
No hands raised, Your Worship.
Okay, in that case, I will come back to this table and I'm just going to look around for any more hands. I don't see any. Councillor Green, anything to add? I'll take.
Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we'll move on at this point to Engineering Services and Public Works. Mr. Payne, back to you.
Thank you, Your Worship. So we're on page 59 of the financial plan. And before I begin, I just wanted to let everyone know where we're at in the presentation schedule. I think at the very least, we should aim to get through the entire operating budget today. That would be in keeping of the previous pace. Frankly, I wanted to improve upon that pace, but it's totally good that there's lots of questions and discussion. That's important. So we do have the entire engineering crew with us today. You've got the Director of Engineering and Public Works, the Superintendent of Public Works, the Manager of Engineering, and then after them, we've got the entire Parks, Rec, and Culture crew. So just to keep that in mind, all the folks are here eager to answer questions. So I'd like to get through those two operating budgets, if at all possible today. So beginning with the engineering division of the Engineering and Public Works Department, some of the accomplishments of the entire department include a significant increase on maintenance and capital works despite COVID-19. So there was a large increase on, in particular, some of our linear assets replacements this year. The department completed the LED streetlight project, began the sanitary sewer master plan. They were able to establish a temporary yard waste at Oak Bay Parks and Rec in cooperation with the Parks and Rec department. They were able to adapt street occupancy to permit patios. They implemented temporary sidewalk widening and engaged a new service provider for curbside organic pickup. So significant accomplishments even under a regular year, especially under COVID conditions. In 2021, of course, they've got a number of things they want to do, a significant expansion again of the capital plan, begin the storm sewer master plan, construct some electric vehicle charging stations, and again, yes, the significant expansion of the capital program overall. So I'm going to run through the engineering services operating budget, as well as the public works, as well as the water and sewer. Water and sewer will be pretty straightforward because council had that budget discussion in November of the year, and nothing has changed there. And we can talk about all of the entire department budget at that time. You'll notice here, I'm just going to point out a little typo that I've got here. We've accidentally put a 42% increase for the street occupancy below. It's a 0% increase here, so we'll fix that. The overall is a 0% increase there. So overall, the department is we're recommending a $30,000 increase to the department forecast. 22,000 of that is salaries and benefits. There's a little bit for software licensing. And we have increased conferences and dues because there's two new positions expected that council approved, the manager of engineering and the program manager of asset management and facilities. So we'll have to pay more dues on that. So that basically makes up the entirety of the engineering department budget increase. Scrolling down, we'll go to the public works division of the engineering and public works department on page 60. We've got modest increases across most of the subdivisions in public works. We have increased the road repair budget, this actual materials and supplies budget by $25,000. And that's really in response to WCB requiring additional flaggers for that service. So to maintain the existing service level, that's a regulated change we need to increase. So that's what we've done there. There have been $31,000 overall in increases to salaries and benefits. Almost no increases to other materials and supplies budgets. There have been increase for equipment costs and utilities as needed. And then, of course, there's an increase in our solid waste division just down below, and that was an approved service level increase for curbside organic, which is a positive enhancement. So now we'll just talk briefly about the sewer utility, which is on page 62 of the financial plan. So this year, council approved a 2.7% to the sewer revenues, which is translated about a $7 increase per average residential home. We were able to reduce some of the projected staffing costs in the sewer collection division here. Council had approved a number of new positions early in 2020, and we've adjusted to what the actual new positions ended up being. We filled those positions now. So there was an adjustment there that kept the increase a little bit lower. At the same time, we were able to increase our transfer to reserve for capital by $100,000. And again, we've got a little typo here. This should say 9%. So a 9% increase to our transfer reserve for sewer there. And then lastly, in terms of this department, we'll just talk about the water utility, which is on page 64 of the financial plan. So the water utility revenue increase was 3.7% overall, about 3.4% to consumer charges, which is about a $21 average per residential home. And the same things occurred in this budget. Council approved a number of positions for the water utility in the maintenance position, and we've been able to adjust those a little bit lower once we fill those positions and fill out what the actual cost of those are. So very modest increases across the way, except for our transfer reserve for water, again, 11% increase for the transfer to reserve. So thank you, Your Worship. That concludes my presentation for this operating budget.
Great. No, thank you very much, Mr. Payne, and happy to take questions from council to either Mr. Payne or to members of the Engineering Public Works team. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. Just one question about the performance measures and statistics. As I look at what was completed in the certainly the storm and the sanitary sewer and the road rehabilitation, looks like relatively, I mean, compared to previous years, I suppose it's quite a bit, but it's still very small percentages of the systems. But my main question is on the road rehabilitation completed. When I look at the pavement master plan, it addresses the roads, the pavement in kilometers, as does the Opus report. But then when we go to the statistics on this, we go into square meters. And I've never seen road rehabilitation in terms of square meters before. But looking at my own, my own calculations for some of this, it seems like it was not that much of roadway that was completed. But of course, that depends on the width of the road. So I'm just wondering why we are not consistent in keeping the measures between all of the different reports consistent, just for clarity.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Councillor Patterson. And I think it ties to a question I was going to ask if it wasn't, which is just some clarification of where the road repair fits under operational versus under the capital. And are those, and maybe that ties as well to how those are measured. So I might go to, I'm not sure who to turn this over to. I'll give it to Mr. Horan, and you can give this to anybody else that you see fit, Mr. Horan.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll start, and we have that funny awkwardness where when we're typically, a year ago had been in the room together, we could make eye contact and sense someone's panic if they don't have an answer, or give like a nod of the head, like I got this. But I'll start, and if Mr. Brozick, if I don't cover it, he'll certainly be able to jump in. I think the best way to say this is just to be very blunt. As a measure of performance or a key performance indicator for roadworks, square meters of rehabilitation work is not the best measure, and we acknowledge that. What we've done in this, what we're trying to do in the last 2 or 3 years, is have something to show in terms of a metric, but I think in the future we'll have to figure out a way to do that better. What we were just trying to show in terms of the statistics were, number one, the amount of funding that was allocated by the council to road rehab has significantly increased. So from around 2015 timeframe of 300,000 per year, roughly, to close to $1 million now, is actually made a huge impact in the amount of planning that we can do and the amount of good road rehab we can do as well. But the actual how to do it in the future, it actually gets quite complex because in the past we've kind of just had a budget set aside for asphalt paving, which is not which is fine if you don't have a lot in the budget, but when you're actually trying to keep a road network working properly, you have to consider things like curb and gutter and sidewalk as part of a bigger picture. So I think there is a challenge here in engineering and public works in the next couple of years to figure out a better way to talk about what are we going to be doing next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how does that match with the funding that's available, and does that actually meet the levels of service? So we're doing our best in terms of reporting out, but we're still on a road to that was a really good pun there. We're on the road to making some improvements as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. And I certainly, I think we all know that this year that the Public Works crew and our engineering department have been very busy around the community, and it is evident that a lot of work has gone in. And so, but I do appreciate that Director Horan is going to perhaps bring a little more clarity to the total rehabilitation of our roads and our sidewalks and our curbs and everything in the community. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I have Councillor Braithwaite next. And then
Thank you.
Councillor
And again, I apologize. I lost connectivity right when Mr. Payne was talking around on page 59 around the street occupancy and boulevard fees. So I missed the explanation as to why there was such a big change there. So if you could just indulge me just to repeat that for me, because I lost my connectivity.
Go ahead. Sorry, was it Mr. Payne that was covering that, or Mr. Haran? Mr. Payne.
Yeah, it was Mr. Payne. Thank you, Your Worship. It was just it's a typo, Councillor Braithwaite. The year-over-year change is actually $0, and so it's 0%. So I was just pointing out the error. Usually you get to the typos before I do, but this time I got there first.
Yeah, so I don't know how I missed that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. I have then Councillor Zelka, then Appleton.
Thank you so much, Chair. Through you to staff. I'm not sure whether this is sort of related to specifically to this budget or the water master plan that I think we saw about a year ago or so ago. Pre-pandemic, my memory is obviously going, but there was some discussion. Maybe it was obviously in a previous mandate, but it was certainly on a special initiatives list at some point to twin our water supply. Right now, I think our main water supply comes through Lansdowne at Foul Bay, and there was some discussion to have a second source of water into Oak Bay. I just wanted to ask through you to staff whether that's part of this budget, or if that's off the table, or where are we at with that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Zelka. Mr. Haran.
Yes, thank you, Worship. I'm very happy to answer that question. I think the best answer to say is this will come up in more detail in capital. So it is part of the capital plan. I'm also very happy to say that Oak Bay Engineering and Public Works as a team are more thoroughly planned out in terms of our capital improvement program than we've been in quite some time, many years, at least in terms of the last 6 or 7 years that Dave Rosick and I have been around, and then now Mr. Rennick. I guess my point is to say that is part of the next 2 or 3 years to start investigating potential options to have some redundancy in terms of water supply, bulk water supply to the district. And then the last thing I'll mention on it is these meetings, it's impossible to talk about the financial plan without getting into a little bit of the details of the capital program. But the capital program itself, in terms of what work we're doing in water, sewer, storm, and transportation and so on, is quite extensive. And probably way more information than can fit into these meetings. So our intention here for the first time, at least in my tenure, is a bit later in the year to come back to the council with more insight in terms of what is the capital program, how do we develop it, how do we prioritize which projects need to happen and when, and to offer some more information about how that's done as we ramp up the amount of planning and execution work we do here in Oak Bay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haran. Mr. Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just one quick question and a couple of observations, just question-wise. I was just wanting a little bit more clarity just with regards to the street safety program. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds as far as operational matters, because that's not for me to decide, but I'm just kind of wondering whether the director or others could sort of just briefly describe how the spend on those is sort of allocated and what guides the year-over-year budgeting for that particular category.
Thank you, Councillor Upland. If I may, I'm going to add another ask to that, which is also in the projected 2021 accomplishments goals. I noticed that the active transportation report isn't on that list, and I just thought I'd flag that as well, if that should be on there in terms of if that's expected back. Go ahead, Mr. Haran.
Yes, thank you, Worship. So I think the question, as I understand it, is with respect to transportation safety, how do we identify and prioritize projects or work to be done? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, so I think again, this is a quite a good question in terms of the capital projects, but I mean, there is an operational aspect to it too. So I guess the best thing to say is in the past, so 2-3 years ago and more, the budgets were quite limited in terms of what was actually in the budget to accomplish. So we're talking maybe a crosswalk or two, maybe a couple of a little bit minor traffic calming. So in the $50,000 or less range, which is really not a lot in terms of what you can accomplish in terms of transportation safety. So in the past, the department just did its best to try to use that funding to do a handful of curb drops, and maybe a crosswalk or two, and hopefully ask for more and not get that. So there was there wasn't necessarily a need to prioritize, because you couldn't go wrong, because you had so many things that should be done, and if you picked one, you were kind of going along the same path. And as things improved over years, the last couple of years, there was still the funding matched the priorities in a way that made a lot of sense, and wasn't you still couldn't go wrong. But what we're seeing now, as the funding continues to increase and the demands are there, we need to have a more of a method in place to prioritize and put the program together. So for this year, last year, this year, it's still quite straightforward for us from our perspective to do it. But as we go forward, there's going to be need to be more of a way for the department to show the community, here's what's coming in the future, and talk about what those priorities are. And so I mentioned it a few minutes ago, that we'd be doing that a little bit later in the year to show, what could be done and what's in the plan, which is not necessarily something that we do in the financial plan meetings. I guess the real thing I'm trying to say is, it was not a demand or thing that was asked for from the department because it wasn't necessary. And now we're in a chicken before the egg scenario, where we take a few steps forward with an excellent financial plan and a good, robust capital improvement program. But then the questions about, well, when does the community get to see it, and how do people get to weigh in? Those are excellent questions, but you've got to do one before you're ready to come and start talking publicly about the other. And there's a resource aspect to that too, which the reporting out on capital improvement programs and putting product together in terms of presentations or reports on what we're doing in terms of this expanding capital program. It's all necessary stuff, but we're not resourced necessarily to handle or to do that quickly. So we have to kind of sequence our work, and then talk about it as best we can. But sometimes it takes time to be able to come back to talk about them in council meetings in a way that we haven't done before.
Thank you. Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I really appreciate the director's comments. I think he's captured very much what I had in mind, or where my thought process was very much about that as we sort of evolve into the infrastructure replacement piece. And as that crystallizes, I definitely concur very much with the director that as we get more information on that, we as a council need to cast our minds forward to how do we engage the community in having those discussions as far as a complete streets and a traffic safety, a pedestrian safety, and all user safety discussion. So I appreciate that. I think the director's captured that very well. And if I could just make a couple of quick comments, Your Worship.
Go ahead.
Thanks. Very quickly, I just wanted to say, point out that the improvements that the engineering department has made, especially in Oak Bay Village this year, and the adaptations that they've had to make in response to COVID, and at the same time improving the community space this year, small changes with, I know, a lot of work behind the scenes, but a big community impact. So, council has heard me mention this before. With the engineering department, a lot of what you do is invisible because it's underground, and a lot of it is not glamorous. This is something that's been really impactful for the community. So I want to recognize that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was in previous budget iterations, I had myself flagged, some concern about some of the staffing allocated and some of the staffing projections allocated for the utility side of things. So I'm just very grateful to see staff return in this financial plan with some revisions, the tweaks, and sort of reflecting the actual rollout of those programs, and sort of making that running change, and acknowledging that that there was an adjustment made there. That's very confidence inspiring. I really, really appreciate that content in the report. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. Just one quick query. I noticed on the performance measures and statistics, it says storm sanitary water service connections, it looks like there was about a 13% improvement over what was completed 2020 to 2019. So that was good. I believe Mr. Haran in the past talked about need for additional staff so that they could keep up with some of that demand. But in 2021 forecast, it says demand 185 and planned 155. I don't know what demand and plan does. I'm not sure how I should be interpreting that. It almost looks like they're not planning to complete them all, and I'm not sure why.
Sure. Thank you, Councillor Patterson. Mr. Haran, can you explain that terminology?
I was desperately looking for my mute button, trying to push buttons so I could talk again. Yeah, absolutely. Would love to talk to that. So the best way to talk about that one, so those are all the service connections. So when a homeowner comes to the municipality and says, I'd like a new water lateral, sewer storm lateral, or driveway access is also part of that, but not necessarily reported in those numbers. The demand is basically the number of residents that come to the municipality say, we need this. The demand back in 2013 was probably about 120 per year, maybe a bit more. I could have that number a bit, but it's not too far off that number. And what we were showing over the years is that by 2015 and consistently since then, the amount of homeowners that have asked for that service has been much more than it was back in 2013. And we were trying to show that the size of public works hadn't changed in response to that additional work. Now, it is cost recovery work, but it does take away from the amount of resources we have available to do our capital work, because the same crews that show up for a day's work to add someone's service lateral is the same crews that would go do a sewer replacement or in terms of mains, in terms of our model that we followed up until this year. So our budget and our capital planning in terms of our resource availability is geared towards 155, if we're saying planned, jobs in a year, and then the rest will have to be deferred to the year after. So if the demand significantly drops or if it significantly increases, it just changes how we allocate our resources in a year. And so far has not had an impact in terms of how we put our budget together, but it is something that we definitely track because it is just in terms of Mr. Brozik's allocation of resources planning a year ahead. So it is definitely a number that we kind of have to set as that's the number of service jobs we're going to do in a year, so that we can also make sure that our public works crews are available to respond to emergencies, our unplanned corrective maintenance, and then also the capital works program that we assign to public works.
Thank you, Mayor. That's really helpful information to know. It certainly identifies all of these things that have to be considered when the planning for the staffing comes before us. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Urgent unplanned maintenance. That's a good term to use for called for a broken water main. I like that. All right. Is there any other questions, Councillor Green?
Yes, thank you very much. And I don't really have any questions. I just have a comment that I really appreciate the level of detail and the explanatory notes that have been provided on this particular budget. It is an area that many of us are not familiar with, to be honest, but we are familiar with it when it backs up or leaks. So it's really appreciated, and I commend Mr. Haran and his team for this level of detail and their commitment. And just one point, and I did email Mr. Haran, forgetting, of course, that he was out of the office, I think about 10 days ago or maybe a week ago, but it was on the lateral maintenance question, and that's been mentioned a few times in the last week or two. It's something that I don't think the average homeowner in Oak Bay is aware of, that they, in fact, are responsible for annual maintenance on their laterals. And so I was just wondering, and I had suggested to Mr. Haran in an email, hoping he wouldn't mind, that if we could do a communications piece at some point on this issue, because honestly, people I speak to, and we ourselves, when we moved here, had no idea that we were responsible. And I'm really glad someone told us that we were, because that's where often issues arise, and that's where there can be a lot of headache if if there's a backup or an overflow. So I was just wondering if the municipality would consider putting out a communication both on the website and maybe with utility bills that homeowners are responsible for that lateral maintenance. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Mr. Huron, do you want to just address ways that we're trying to accomplish exactly that goal?
Yeah, absolutely, Your Worship. This is actually one of those initiatives that we had in our work plan for 2020, because it was really it's a bit heartbreaking actually when issues come up with property damage and people have, in terms of the big storms we have, and when they can be attributed to maintenance issues that are not the municipality's responsibility. It's just really difficult. So we thought that last year, actually a couple of times over the years, like maybe there's a way to do a public affairs kind of exercise to try to just get as many people aware as possible that there's things that could be done in the dry season to make things better. But unfortunately, with the ramp up of the with COVID hitting last year, it was one of those tasks that kind of just fell off they had to be deprioritized so that we could do all the work that we did do, plus all the COVID stuff. So it's back in the plan for this year, hopefully. The idea would be a couple of things, but one of them, as was hoped for last year, was an insert in the utility bills, for example, that would just talk a little bit about, hey, have you, as a reminder, here's what you've done in terms of your maintenance, or what you should do in terms of your maintenance to keep yourself ready for the wet season. And then it's another example of something that we all recognize that we'd love to do more of, but we don't necessarily have any changes to our staff up until recently to do that. So a lot of the outward talking about what do you get with your, you pay your water bills, you pay your sewer rates, and then you have your taxes related infrastructure. And we'd love to talk more about how great the water is in Oak Bay and in the region, and what happens when the public works crews are on the streets and why they're there. And it's tax dollars at work kind of discussions. And now we've added a communication specialist, which is excellent. And already there's an impact in being able to talk about those things. So we'd love to see us do more of that. But we just also need to recognize that it is a change in terms of level of service, that it's a demand on time that we would add to our work plans, but not necessarily with any changes in terms of the amount of members of the team that we have. So it's a challenge going forward. So we kind of have to balance that as we try to tackle those. Thank you, Mr.
Huron. Councillor Green, anything else?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Huron, and I do appreciate the staffing issue. Anyway, it is an ongoing issue, and I agree with you that it is heartbreaking when people have, episodes and weren't aware that it was their responsibility. So thank you very much. I'm glad to see that it's back in the work plan, and I'll keep my fingers crossed that your team can find some time to do that particular task. Thanks for all you do, though, in the meantime.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Any other hands? I don't see any. Anybody from the public called in on this item, Ms. Morton?
There is not, Your Worship.
Okay, so just gonna one last look for hands, questions, nothing. So we'll move on. I believe that brings us right through Public Works to the, to the water utility and Parks, Recreation and Culture. Are we at Parks, Rec and Culture now, Mr. Payne?
Yes, sir. Page 67 is where I'm going to begin in the financial plan.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And as mentioned, we got the whole Parks, Rec and Culture crew here, manager of administration, the manager of recreation, manager of parks, and the director of Parks, Rec and Culture. So we're happy to have them here. So I'm going to run you through some of the accomplishments during the year, as well as plans for next year, and a brief discussion of some of the variances we see in the budgets. One thing to note, I just always think it's remarkable to note, is the amount of visits that Parks, Rec and Culture hosts throughout the year in the various facilities. In 2019, 1.2 million, and in 2020, still found a way to host 500,000 visits. So just significant operations. In 2020, the department completed the replacement of the roof over the Oak Bay Rec Center. They applied for a grant for the chiller. But most significantly, they managed the department operations and community use of facilities, parks and programs through the pandemic. So this department, I think it's fair to say, really was most impacted by the ebbs and flows of the pandemic and the public health orders and the changing conditions and variables and the changing expectations from our customers. They bore the brunt of that and led the customers through that admirably. In fact, they were able, amongst that, for lack of a better term, chaos, they implemented the ambassador program at Willows Beach, which was a successful program and completely cost recovery from the province as well. So exceptional there. In 2021, if we're successful in the chiller grant, they will initiate the process to replace that chiller, undertake public Wi-Fi in all of the facilities, and resurface tennis court at Windsor Park, among another, number of other things. So those are some of the things that I highlighted here. I'm going to go down now to page 69, which is the expenditure variances. I've skipped over the revenue variances, but for the most part, the expenditure variances can tell the same story as the revenue variances, and often they're quite a bit linked. So overall, the revenues, the forecasted revenues, the budgeted revenues for 2021 are $4.2 million less than what we had budgeted early on in 2020. And that's contrasted with $1.6 million in reduced expenditures. So a net about $2.6 million. We're offsetting that with the COVID restart grant at $2.5 million. And we've set aside the remaining $1 million of that grant for 2022, if needed to continue supporting the operations and the revenue loss that has resulted. The department integrated a number of cost-saving measures as best as they could while maintaining the maximum service that they could provide under the current COVID conditions. A reduction in training and travel, professional development, brochures, etc. But there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit there. The department did shift some facility use to more profitable use, but they were careful at the same time not to sacrifice general public good. So, for instance, some of the facilities could be used in a more profitable way, but that would really limit accessibility to the public in a significant way. And in that case, we didn't do that. So they wanted to maintain the service levels as best as possible through the COVID-19 pandemic. So the variances here, they really represent using the facilities to deliver the existing programs at the highest capacity available on the COVID-19 restrictions. So you understand what I mean when I move through some of the variances here. I'll start first with the Henderson variance of 18% reduction. And there's a limitations on the attendance in that facility, which is really what impacted revenue in that. Even in the golf program, there was additional space required for folks, smaller groups required, and cleaning in between groups. So that really limited the capacity of how many customers could be served at the Henderson facility. So again, it's not a demand issue in this case. There's demand for the public rec center use, but we cannot fill that demand with existing services. We use the facilities as much as possible during that time. The same can be said for the various fitness centers. Again, we're just limited in terms of capacity, how many people can use that. And again, previously the department would budget significant net revenues from instructor-driven programs, but in favor of providing the facility to greater use for the general public, we weren't able to do that, right? So general drop-in, the facilities were used to the maximum capacity, but revenues suffered as a result of COVID-19 capacity restrictions. Aquatics is a good example. Previously to the pandemic, the district could really host more than 200 people in the pool at any given time, but the maximum under the current conditions is 80. So significant reduction in admission to the pool as a result. The arena was fairly cost neutral when you consider the drop in revenue versus the drop in expenses is fairly cost neutral. There's an example of more profitable use. The demand was reduced for some of the drop in, but it increased for some of the groups. And so overall, the more profitable per unit group was made up there. And the last variance that I'll chat about briefly before I hand it over for questions to the Parks, Rec, and Culture staff is in the licensed care facility. So there we actually did see a drop in demand in terms of people that wanted to use those services. Many folks were working from home, and so they were providing care at home, or many people were concerned about spreading COVID-19. So the department actually budgeted for 75% of capacity, when previous years we would budget for around 95% of capacity for those facilities. So that will conclude my presentation here, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Payne. Again, we can put on the numbers for the public to call, and you can call now and wait on the queue if you wish, or just raise your hand and we'll get to you after the council questions. I have Councillor Braithwaite and Appleton to start.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Payne, for that. I would like to add my accolades to this department. I think that you're right. This was the most impacted department out of our whole municipality, and how they came through this past year by being able to turn on a dime to change programs or to implement something, for example, meals being delivered from Monterey Center or something like that. I think they all deserve a real round of applause for that, because I think that it really helped our municipality, how they were able to keep certain things running, and I really appreciate it. So thank you to them. I do have a couple of questions or a couple of comments. Number one, I noticed that on page 66, it talked about some planting trees on municipal land, and that there was an increase of about 23% of trees being planted on municipal land. And I'm wondering if that, if that number takes into account, or how we show how many trees were taken down on municipal land, and whether that comes as some other part in a report. I'm imagining it probably comes in the annual report, but that's just one question. But great that we've increased our trees on municipal land by 23%. And then my other question was around the numbers on the revenue side, Mr. Payne, that I know that you didn't really spend a lot of time on, but I'm just wondering, under the HSP grant, that's on page 68, it shows a difference of 100%, but is that correct, or should that be 0%?
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Mr. Payne, can you address, maybe I'll let you redirect probably the first question to Ray Herman or to one of the other staff, but perhaps you can address the numbers question first.
Yes, Your Worship, Councillor Braithwaite is right. That should be a 0% increase. It's the same as last year. Yeah.
And then on the top where it says tree cutting and planting, it says 0%. I think that might be, I just noticed that one as well. Is that one correct, or?
If it's going from 0 to anything, it's going to be like an infinite change. So it's an interesting way that'll get recorded on there. I'll let staff take that away to put it down.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, but
so
thank you.
Let's get to the main question then on the trees planting portion of that, and where that would be reported if not here. Mr. Herman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, my recollection is that the net trees planted versus trees removed does show up in the annual report statistics. So I would expect that we'll be able to forward that through to the folks who compile that information at the appropriate time.
Okay, and can you address the tree cutting and planting budget line item in terms of what that's intended for?
I think I might. The change there. I can talk to the change. What happened with the new tree bylaw that took place is substantial increase in revenue with respect to permits. What has also, of course, happened along with that is a significant increase in the amount of work that takes to process those, monitor, report, follow up on refunds and things like that. So there's a kind of a wash in the budget where we've increased the revenue for those permits to $25,000 where there was really none before. And there's a corresponding $25,000 embedded on the expense side to allow for some additional staff resources. So it's kind of a wash, but it allows us to run that program in a streamlined fashion. I hope that answers the question. Beyond that, I may defer to Mr. Hidley or Ms. McCarron.
I think that answers it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. I then have Councillor Appleton Patterson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm going to ask a question in my capacity as library board trustee. I just want, as council is aware, we had a leak and a flood in the library building this past year, well, just a couple of months ago. And I'm just wanting to just confirm that there may have been a short-term fix and then maybe a contemplated long-term fix, but I just wanted to confirm that does that land in building maintenance under this category, or does that land in capital someplace, or sort of where does that sit, and has a comprehensive fix for the issue been budgeted for in the upcoming year?
Probably more importantly, Mr. Payne, I'm going to give you that question because you would know where those monies would be sitting.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I don't believe that the I'm actually not sure. That's one I'm going to have to come back to you with, Councillor Appleton. I apologize.
No, not through you, Your Worship. No, that's fine. I think I know that I have some follow-up discussions sort of scheduled with GVPL staff, and then that question may come up just to say what's sort of the long-term issue. They may, of course, want to, this may go into the operational category and they may want to loop around with you, but I did not want to make a commitment that there was a budget assigned to repairs without checking with staff first, although I would assume that if something was broke that it was going to get fixed.
Well, that's specific enough. We'll take that one offline to talk to staff about it and come back on that. Councillor Patterson, anything else? Sorry, Councillor Appleton. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and through you to staff. This is kind of a follow-up to what Councillor Braithwaite raised, and I think that having the parks and rec all together here may have served a useful purpose in the past. But I think that as some of the programs like the urban forest strategy matures, and certainly as we see now that we want to move forward and looking at more of our green spaces, I would almost like to see a separate budget within this that is really dedicated more to the green spaces, trails, urban forest, and particularly as we maybe move forward valuing the natural assets. So I just throw that out there. I know it is reported in the annual plan, but I think it would be helpful at least to me, to have a more focused discussion on it also at the budget time, because the way it all merges, I don't know that it really serves, it doesn't do justice to the Parks Department and the work they do. And because the other portions of the department are so over encompassing of the whole Parks and Recs. So I just throw that out for comment and maybe consideration in future years. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Patterson. I think it ties to the general shift we're trying to make to a service level, budgeting and pieces as well. And it is not clear sometimes whether we're, increasing services in parks, what that would actually impact on this piece. So something to take away, I think, for council or for staff consideration and future, not for changing this year, but I think that's a well taken point. And Mr. Payne, I'm just before I go, I wouldn't mind a quick comment from you, but I'd also just like maybe to staff. I've lost sight of Councillor Ney. I just want to can we just reach out to her and make sure she's still able to join us or be on this meeting. But while you're doing that, I'll just go to Mr. Payne and just, your take in terms of possible ways of organizing the budget in a way that reports sort of some of the operational and service level within the Parks, Recreation and Culture.
Yes, Your Worship. It really is up for discussion, simply because last year, I believe the format of the Parks, Rec and Culture operations was changed quite a bit. We separated the revenues from the expenditures. However, there is certainly a lot of value in showing the performance of the various programs and divisions as well. So there's other ways of organizing organizing the information, and so we'll certainly take any comments into consideration. And I just have to work with my colleagues at Park Rec and Culture to present the information in the most readable and understandable way possible.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I don't want to get into the weeds today so much on it, but I just appreciate Councillor Patterson, you raising it, because it is, and welcome back, Councillor Ney. I know we lost you there for a minute, so thanks for finding your way back. I just want to acknowledge on this how all of these things that we're asking questions about and touching base on in terms of these statistics and reporting and metrics, we're not here even 2 or 3 years ago, so they're all new as part of this. And I just sometimes it's easy to get caught up in how to make it better, but I want to take a moment just to say, hey, well done to get us to this point, because we wouldn't even be able to ask these questions if they weren't on this report. So I just think it's worth taking that moment. Any questions? Any other questions, Councillor Green, since you're not on the screen? Anything from you?
Excuse me, no. A lot of my questions have been answered, but I also want to join with other voices to say how much I know the recreation team, Parks and Recreation team, have worked so hard this year under extremely challenging circumstances, and I know we've all been thinking about them quite often. And I just want to congratulate them on their perseverance and their innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Any other questions for Parks, Rec and Culture on their budget? I'm not seeing any. I'll just reiterate what Councillor Green just said. It's been a very tough time for Parks, Rec and Culture. Mr. Herman, Mr. Meagle, your whole team there. It's been a tough space, managing the staffing, managing keeping services going, keeping our washrooms clean, keeping things safe for the public, keeping our beaches and parks open. All that work has been phenomenal, and I know it's been tough. So, and it will be this year as well. And I really appreciate the efforts taken here to find ways of reducing costs while still keeping services open for our public. And I think it's really important for people who are looking at this and wondering why we're not being a bit more draconian and why we're applying these grants to Parks and Rec. It's really because that physical and social connections and other pieces that these all address is so critical at this time for people to be able to get those exercises and get out in the parks and use our facilities. It's limited, but it's important that we still provide it just for the broader health of our community. I think that's the approach that we've taken as a council. So really appreciate staff's efforts to with that and support of that philosophy and doing everything they're doing to make it so phenomenal. So I know it'll pay off in spades when things open up again too. The that loyalty that we've shown and the efforts made. The people who have always used us will be back and continuing to use our excellent services. So, any other questions for the Parks, Rec, and Culture group? I'm not seeing any, so that concludes that portion. Is there? Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm getting to my notes in order. I've lost my order here a little bit. I think that brings us to number 6, capital budget presentations. Is that correct, Mr. Payne?
Yes, Your Worship. Correct me if I'm wrong. Does the meeting end at 9 tonight?
Yeah, it does. So I was just going to say, if that's the draw point, then I think we should probably call it at this point, as we're at 8:55. Unless there's any other outstanding questions from members of council. I'm not seeing any or hearing any. So, Mr. Payne, before we go, is there anything else you think it's worth touching on in the last few minutes that we have allocated for this meeting?
No, Your Worship. I'll just remind the public that next week it is the capital budget. It's usually a long meeting, lots of input provided. We do talk about all the engineering programs as well as Parks, Rec, and Culture. So it's a great meeting to attend and provide comment if you wish.
Great. Thank you very much. So with that, we'll just get a motion to
adjournment.
Yeah, just a second. My phone is buzzed. I want to make sure I'm not getting any last minute things from staff. Oh, and we're good. So, yep, no, ready to go. Just motion to adjourn. Thank you.
Move adjournment.
Thank you.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. 8:56. We'll call this meeting adjourned, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week after the long weekend. On next Thursday, I guess, is our next meeting. So take care, everyone. Enjoy the longer weekend, and we'll talk to you all soon.
And